Hey everyone, welcome back to my Level Up vlog series where I talk about just some level up moments and also kind of advanced magic thinking and strategy to improve my magic skill. Alright, we'll nail the intro better eventually. Today is a pretty abstract one and pretty interesting one. It's the idea of reading tempo. So in Command Fest Philly, I was playing with my buddy Braden. He was playing Paco Holden, and I was playing Gale and Scion of whatever, Demir Gale. And I had a Talrand in play, and we eventually got to this point where we're 1v1ing each other, and this is after Braden just started playing a lot more modern and less CDH. And eventually he concedes, saying, he can see that the game's over now. I have my engine on and not gonna be able to beat it. So the interesting thing here, he says afterwards, really stuck with me, is he said that ever since he started playing modern, he can see the game differently. He can read the board differently. And when he's playing CDH in that match, it felt like playing CDH, or it felt like playing Commander. As soon as it was a 1v1 between him and I, he immediately was able to read the game as you would in a 1v1 game. So that thought was very interesting to me, which partly led to why I went on this kind of quest or journey to learn more about Magic, learn more about how to play it better, is because this idea of being able to read the game differently was very interesting. I wanted to know what that means. And if Braden's able to see the game differently, how would a pro player see the game differently and all of that. So for today's subject is about reading the board and reading the tempo of the board. So when we talk about tempo, the definition of tempo is sometimes kind of hard to nail, but I think the best one so far is what Zach Allen told me in an older video of mine.
I'd like to give my definition, which is effective mana invested into your board state, or if you like to take that a step further, invested towards your combo.
He defined tempo as the amount of mana you have invested on your board. And it's not the literal mana, like the mana cost, but how much mana's worth of an effect do you have invested on that board. So for example, Delver of Secrets, one of the most famous tempo creatures out there, the 1 mana 1/1 that turns into a 3/2 or flips into a 3/2 that flies, right? It's 1 mana, but then when it flips, it no longer feels like a 1 mana creature anymore because it has flying and it's a 3/2, right? The amount of effect that you have invested in your board is suddenly more than your opponent. As long as you have more mana's worth invested on the board versus your opponent, ideally you should win that game. And that's playing tempo, where you're disrupting or removing the investment that they have or ability to invest into the board or affect the game when you have a 3/2 beating them down. So that's just tempo as a summary. I'm probably got it wrong somewhere, and you can ding me in the comments, whatever. So how I advanced this thought a little bit more is reading The Philosophy of Fire. So if you haven't read this, it's a very older article that essentially proposes the idea of relating life and cards. And it kind of talked about necropotence and how much a card is worth in terms of necropotence. You pay 1 life, get a card. So how much is that card worth in terms of life value? So it's basically just assigning life totals value to a card. So how does that relate to tempo? What is very valuable is when I'm not in the beatdown, when I'm playing against a burn deck, I can start looking at my cards in my hand to see if it's worth its life total in exchange, right? I'm trying to suppress the attacker, which is the red deck. They're on the beatdown. If you don't, I talked about this in the last video before, so if you don't know what I'm talking about, you can watch that very quickly about asking questions. But if I'm trying to stop the aggressor, then I can start looking at my cards like Spell Pierce and seeing that this Spell Pierce is gonna conserve me 2 life, right? Or it's gonna conserve me 3 life if I'm able to use it on a piece of removal. If I play a blocker, it's saving me 3 life, even though they can always lightning strike it. If I play my Ledger Shredder, right, they kill it immediately, I save myself 3 life, and so on. If I'm playing a game plan where I'm trying to buy time to understand how long I can play this game, I can start looking at the cards in my hand and understanding or reading the cards in their hand to see, alright, at this point they have 4 cards left in hand, they have a 2/2 blocker or whatever, killing it first is probably the best, but if I assume that all those burn spells or shocks, then I can gauge how much life I need to account for to stay alive to ultimately win the game. I'm trying to apply foresight long enough to understand At what point, if every single card is a shock, will I die to all the shocks? When do I have to immediately start turning or closing the game because I can't draw this game out indefinitely? I have to close it before they burn me out, right? In that sense, Philosophy of Fire, applying life total to cards, is very, very important because I'm able to plot my entire game and gauge what my cards are worth just from looking at the board, right? That is literally what Braden said. I can just see the game differently. And when you start kind of paying attention to the mana's worth of things, of effects, and the tempo on a board, the way you play actually changes. So there was a game I played in LA in Turn Zero Games. Actually, the hat. Where's the hat? Shout out Turn Zero Games. I played a draft for Double Masters. I have no idea how to draft that set. And I made a mono white deck for Charles. I thought it'd be funny. And I opened a Lily of the Last Hope and kind of just jammed in like 5 swamps and made a mono. Anyways, who cares? Who cares what the story is? In my second game, I think my opening hand had like 4 white spells, and then I flooded the rest of the game. I think in the totality of that like 15 turn game, I had like 7 or 8 actual like spells. Everything else was a land. And as frustrating as that is, I almost won that game. I was able to make my opponent spend more cards with the limited amount of cards I had, because I'm able to look at how much my cards are worth, gauge how long I need to live in that game to try and get my Haymaker of Lily of the Last Hope and try and like start to grind my way out of that game. But being able to see what I have, see what they have, see if it's worth making that exchange, how much life am I going to gain, how many cards can I take out of their hand by making the right blocks, things like that really, really actually helped my game, as opposed to just sitting there and trying to think like, what is the best way for me to win this game? Actually like looking at the board and seeing all the permanents there and making those decisions massively helped, especially playing limited. I think that's very, very helpful. So another thing I want to talk about in terms of tempo and like kind of reading tempo of a board is I think tempo changes. What I want to talk about in terms of kind of like the shifting of tempo is like noticing what period of the game you're in and what type of kind of investment you need to win that part of the game. Now, with tricks and removal and things like that, you want to use it to the best effect of limiting their investment on their board so your board is better and you can like push through and leverage that advantage, right? That's stuff I think most players know how to do. But on the subject of shifting tempos, I think what's really interesting to apply to CDH in this series isn't just about CDH, but I think it's interesting to think about it, is it's really illustrated from CDH when you play with stacks. And this is something that my buddy Mono White Guy, Charles, likes to bring up, is the idea of when you're playing stacks, you're able to make your opponent's cards worth less or feel like they're worth less, right? Or be worse, which is exhibited by cards like, what's that? I like to play Brina. Now, there's a heuristic. You never want your opponents to draw cards, especially in a 4-player game where if you play Brina and allow your opponents to all draw cards, that trade-off isn't good, right? That one card is giving 3 cards back to your opponent. However, if you're playing stacks and you play things like Thalia or other effects that either increase the cost or reduce their effect, like a Torpor Orb, suddenly you feeding those cards to your opponent doesn't matter as much because your permanent there, that in this example Brina, is actually becoming more mana's worth of things, right? It's no longer a 3-mana flyer, it's gonna be huge. If all your opponents take the draw, your Brina is going to be massive, and it's going to make your board even stronger, right? Especially in a stacks out board, the cards they're drawing are just less valuable. Like, even though you're letting them draw, it doesn't matter as much because your board is controlling what the tempo of your opponents are. It's controlling what they're able to do. It kind of like goes back to the idea of the shifting feeling of tempo. Suddenly that Chain of Vapor is in a much worse rate when you have to pay 2 or 3 mana to cast it, right? Chain of Vapor is still very valuable, of course, to start removing the stacks pieces, but it's much worse of a card, especially if you leverage stacks effects against Storm decks where it's hyper efficient. removing that efficiency makes their cards just feel worse. Or another example of how this applies to CDH is Ad Nauseam. You applying pressure to an opponent playing Ad Nauseam is worthwhile because each point of life you take is another card potentially they're not going to get, right? And trying to read how much life you need to take away until their Ad Nauseam starts being like, almost unusable or too risky is a very important skill, and vice versa. If you're playing Ad Nauseam deck, you have to make a decision to see how much life you're willing to trade versus maybe a blocker or permanents you have to see how much life you're willing to exchange there. It's exactly Philosophy of Fire again. How much life are these cards worth, or how much damage am I able to take to continue my plan? So I think I'll stop there for today. Hopefully this somewhat makes sense. To bring it all the way back to the original example, I think when I have something like Talrand in a spell casting deck and every single spell I cast gives me a 2/2 flyer, that's just incredibly above rate, right? In a game where they can no longer play an axis of combo, where they can kind of skirt by this game of tempo, it's incredibly difficult, I think, for someone to beat this unless they have like, a board wipe, right? Every single card of mine now gives me a shock that can shock repeatedly per every turn as long as the Drake doesn't die. That's very difficult to beat. And trying to like think about how much life your cards are worth is actually very valuable and very helpful. That's it. That's Tempo. I think. Hope this was helpful. See you next time.